Chapter 9. Monday, October 9th, 12:15 a.m., the south side of Chicago, heading north. They left Jeannie and Bruno's burning neighborhood behind and headed north. Oscar kept looking over his shoulder at that giant orange globe leading through the sky. The main fire was huge now, Oscar could see, and it was spreading fast. And the wind was carrying sparks all over the city. Everywhere Oscar looked, he saw new fires burning. Some fires were very small. A ribbon of flame waving from a tree, a pile of garbage glowing like a campfire. But there were burning houses everywhere, and in places the smoke was so thick that they had to gasp for breath. But Oscar's gasps also came from what was happening all around them. People sobbing and screaming, horses driven crazy by the heat and sparks, stray dogs howling in fear. Even the rats were running for their lives, rushing out from under the wooden sidewalks and getting squashed under the wheels of the wagons and the buggies that plowed through the streets. The crowds got bigger as they moved north. Many people were dragging trucks and suitcases or struggling with heavy sacks heaved over their shoulders. 2 women in nightgowns carried a mattress above their head. On top was a very old man curled up under a quilt. The fires turned the night as bright as day, lightening up the terrified faces all around Oscar. The tear-stained cheeks, the mouths open in horror, the wide open eyes looking up at the sky. But the worst part was the howling wind, which seemed to be getting stronger by the minute. Each hot gust was filled with dust and smoke and spit out millions of embers and sparks. One burned a hole clear through the toe of Oscar's boot. Oscar passed a woman just as her skirt erupted into flames. Luckily, the man next to her had a canteen of water and quickly drenched her. The sparks were terrible for Oscar and Jeannie, but they tortured poor Bruno. "Ha! Ha!" he kept saying, trying to bury his face in Oscar's neck. Finally, Jeannie spotted an overturned wheelbarrow with a heap of clothes spilling out. She snatched a lady's hat, its purple velvet smudged with dirt, the wide brim crushed. "I don't think anyone will miss this," she said. She put it on Bruno's head, a perfect helmet to protect his curls. She kept her eyes on Oscar, swatting away embers that came too close to his face or smoldered on his clothes. Oscar was getting the idea that there wasn't much Jeannie couldn't take care of. They came to a corner where a crowd of people had stopped to watch a grand brick building burn. Oscar and Jeannie tried to push their way through, but they were completely hemmed in. And then, suddenly, the clanging of bells rose above the roar of the fire. "Fire department!" someone shouted. People jumped out of the way as 2 steam pumper wagons came tearing around the corner, each pulled by 2 sweating horses. A hose wagon followed. Oscar's heart lifted a bit. He remembered what Mr. Morrow had told them, that Chicago had the best fire department in the world, and here was their chance to prove it. Maybe they could save at least part of the city. People in the crowd watched hopeful as about 15 firefighters hopped off the wagons and got to work, readying the pumper and uncoiling the heavy canvas hoses. In Castle, there was no fire departments or pumper engines. When the fire broke out, people had to rely on themselves and their neighbors. During the big fire, a flurry of sparks had ignited the roof of Oscar's barn. Within minutes, 30 people had rushed to their farm, ready to help. They grabbed every bucket and jug they could find, and formed a bucket brigade. Mama and 2 other women had stood at the well, filling the buckets as fast as they could. Everyone else lined up, forming a human chain that led from the well to the barn. Oscar stood on the line, passing slushing buckets of cold water to the fire. It was amazing how those heavy buckets flew across the chain of hands, how the splashes of water tamed the flames. Oscar had kept going even after his arms were numb with pain. It had taken an hour, but they had put the fire out. The roof of the barn had burned through, but the rest of the building still stood. Oscar would never forget how happy he felt when the last of the flames fizzled out, as he had helped slay a monster. He watched now as the firefighters dragged the heavy coils over to the burning buildings, screaming at people in the crowd to stand back as the pumper engines roared and water pulsed into the hoses. Like soldiers in battle, the men aimed their hoses. Cheers rose out from the crowd as thick, powerful sprays of water blasted up at the flames. Very quickly, Oscar realized that the firefighters didn't stand a chance. The fire was too big and too hot. The water hissed as it got close to the flames and then boiled away into puffs of steam. With every gust of wind, the flames rose higher, twisting and dancing in the sky as though teasing the firefighters. They'd need an ocean to put out those flames, Oscar reckoned, or a bucket brigade of 1,000 people. Come on, Jeannie said, spotting a break in the crowd. As they pushed their way through, Oscar turned to take a last look at the firefighters. There was no mistaking the fear on their faces. There was no doubt. Chicago was doomed. Chapter 10. The three of them walked for at least an hour more, inching their way along the packed sidewalks. They were getting closer to the Palmer house, Jeannie said, but new fires kept forcing them to find alternative routes. Now they were caught in a sea of hundreds of bodies. People squeezed them on all sides, and Oscar struggled to stay on his feet. They were passing by a warehouse when suddenly, kaboom! The smell of oil filled the air, and shards of wood flew all around them. Run! Someone screamed. Boom! 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 The explosions rang out like cannon fire. Like a herd of cattle startled by a clap of thunder, the crowd erupted into a stampede. Oscar, Jeannie, and Bruno were caught right in the middle. Elbows jabbed them, boots mashed Oscar's feet. He watched as parents were torn away from their children. A woman fell and didn't get up again. Hold on tight, Bruno, Oscar ordered, locking his arms around the boy as he gripped Jeannie's hand so hard he was sure he would crush it. They were separated now. They'd never find each other again. Luckily, the street widened slightly, and they managed to burst out of the crushing crowd. Jeannie led them down a side street, and finally into a wide alley. State Street is just a block away from here, Jeannie said, as they caught their breath. The Parnell house will be right here. Halfway down the alley, they discovered a water barrel. They all ran toward it, desperate to quench their thirst and to cool their burning skin. Oscar felt like a stalk of wheat shriveled in the boiling sun. He hoisted the lid off and held Bruno while the boys slurped up water like a thirsty horse. When he was finally done, Oscar and Jeannie took turns scooping up handfuls of the cool water and gulping them down. They splashed the soothing water on their faces and down scorched necks and arms. Oscar sighed with relief. You really know your way around the city, he said to Jeannie as he dabbed drops of water onto his burned forehead. You make a good tracker. My mother was a baker, Jeannie said with a hint of pride. Bruno and I used to go with her to deliver her cakes and cookies. I love cookies, Bruno whispered to Oscar as though he was sharing a deep secret. A picture popped into Oscar's mind. He saw Jeannie with her braids straight and glossy, Bruno nibbling on a cookie almost as big as his head. He pictured a lady with Bruno's dark curls and Jeannie's big brown eyes, sitting in the kitchen in a flowered apron. My mama got sick, Bruno said softly. She in heaven. Jeannie glanced at Oscar, and he glimpsed the fresh hurt in her eyes. My papa's in heaven, too, Oscar said, swallowing the lump in his throat. Our father died right after Bruno was born, in an accident, Jeannie said. Mama died 6 months ago. I promised her I'd keep an eye on Bruno, no matter what. Oscar thought of his own promise to Papa to watch over the farm. That promise had kept him going those past 2 years. But now it was broken. Would Papa forgive him? Would Oscar forgive himself? Jeannie put her head on Bruno's head. I couldn't let us go to an orphanage, Jeannie said. Her voice dropped very low when she said orphanage, as if it was a curse word no one should ever say. Oscar understood. He had heard horror stories about the orphanage in Minneapolis, the city closest to Castle, that it was more like a jail than a home. Oscar looked at Jeannie and Bruno, suddenly wondering what would happen to them. Their home was gone. They were all alone. What would they do? But no, Oscar suddenly remembered. They weren't alone. He picked up Bruno. They weren't alone because they had Oscar. Hey, Bruno, he said. I bet up in heaven my papa and your parents are good friends. Bruno leaned back so he could look Oscar in the eye. "Like us!" he exclaimed. His soot-covered face grinned out from under the fancy lady's hat. Both Oscar and Jeanie laughed, and for that second, Oscar forgot about the smoke and the flames. But their smiles didn't last long. They had just started walking through the alley again when they heard loud voices. A group of boys swung into the alley from the street. They were walking toward them. Jeanie froze. Then Oscar saw who they were. The boys from the train station. And there, right in front, with his rattlesnake eyes glowing through the smoke, was Otis Weber.